The Last Night of Rothenburg, Chapter 4. The Fortress of Allgäu. The stench of blood hung in the air, clinging to their skin, their clothes, clinging to their very souls. Wilhelm's company stood over the bodies of the fallen, breath coming in ragged gasps. The fight had been brutal, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on them like the creeping death itself. Isolde knelt beside her brother's broken body, her mask pulled aside, revealing the lines of desperation carved deep into her face. He was dying. They all knew it. His breaths were shallow, rattling in his chest as the creeping death gnawed at him from the inside. His skin had begun to blacken, veins turning to darkened roots under his pale flesh. Still he clung to life long enough to speak, his voice a frail whisper, barely heard over the wind. They talked, a fortress, high in the Alps, he rasped, his breath a pained shudder. Clean water, they catch it from the sky, but it's locked away. Only the royals, the rest, they die thirsty. Isolde's eyes burned, tears brimming but not falling. She closed his eyes gently as his last breath slipped away. The creeping death had claimed another, and they were left with nothing but the promise of clean water, a promise that could save them all if they could reach it. Wilhelm, Caspar, and Berold had already been en route towards the Swiss Alps in the hopes of finding sanctuary in the town of the Soil Towers. This town with clean water, was it the same? The climb through the Allgäu Alps was merciless. The path was steep, the air thin, and Berold, now little more than a shadow of himself, was barely conscious as they dragged him up the rocky terrain. His skin had turned a sickly grey, his breath shallow and ragged. Caspar and Wilhelm bore most of his weight, each step slow and deliberate, knowing that if they stopped, it would mean death. But Isolde pressed on, driven by her brother's last words. The fortress in the mountains, clean water, free from the poison that stained the world below. The fortress was no legend, it was real, and they had no choice but to reach it. When they finally reached the ridge, the fortress came into view. It loomed over the landscape, black and jagged, its stone walls rising like a curse out of the rock. It wasn't a place of refuge, it was a prison for the damned. High above, massive conduits and pipes twisted down from the peaks, collecting rainwater and funneling it into giant holding tanks hidden deep within the fortress. Water, pure and clean, yet locked away from the dying masses. The royals have everything, Isolde whispered, her voice cold with hatred. They hoard the water, the one thing that could save us all, and they let the rest of the world die. In the shadow of the fortress walls, Wilhelm, Caspar, and Isolde huddled together, discussing their next move. Isolde had scouted ahead, returning with grim news. The guards, they're slaves, desperate people, broken by the royals. But two of them are different. The twins, brutes. They're the ones who control everything, and the slaves fear them more than death itself. Wilhelm frowned. They're the key, then. If we can break them, we can get inside. They're not bright, Isolde said, her voice edged with disdain. But they're brutal. They rule with fists and chains. If we can get close enough, maybe we can convince them to turn. Convince? Wilhelm raised an eyebrow. They want the same thing we do, survival, Isolde replied. We'll offer them what they need, but they're not going to take kindly to trickery. Isolde's plan was simple, but dangerous. She would approach the twins, offering them something more valuable than water, knowledge of the creeping death. She would tell them she knew how to stop it, appealing to their base instinct. Meanwhile, Wilhelm and Caspar would slip into the fortress, using the distraction to reach the water and disable the guards. The twins stood at the gates of the fortress, towering figures of brute force and intimidation. Their helmets gleamed in the moonlight, and their massive frames cast long shadows over the broken slaves huddled beneath them. They were the enforcers, the muscle behind the royals' greed. Isolde approached cautiously, her steps measured. The twins watched her with cold, animalistic curiosity. "I bring an offer," Isolde said, her voice steady. "Something that could save your lives." One of the twins, his voice a gravelly growl, stepped forward. "What could a rat like you possibly offer us?" "I know what the creeping death is. I know how to stop it." The second twin's eyes narrowed behind his helmet. "You're lying." "Am I?" Isolde challenged. "Look around you. The creeping death doesn't care who you are. It'll reach this fortress eventually, but if you listen to me, I can show you how to survive." The twins hesitated, their greed and fear wrestling behind their brutish gazes. Before they could decide, one of them turned, eyes catching movement in the shadows. His voice bellowed through the cold night. "She's a distraction!" The fight erupted in an instant. Wilhelm and Caspar, sneaking toward the water tanks, were spotted. The twins roared with fury, charging forward with the force of an avalanche. They were monstrous in their strength, swinging massive hammers that crushed stone and flesh alike. Caspar barely dodged a blow that would have shattered his skull, and Wilhelm fought with the savage desperation of a man who knew he had no other choice. The larger twin swung his hammer in wide arcs, knocking Caspar to the ground. The brute laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed off the stone walls. But then, from high above, came a sound that would change everything, a sharp crack, followed by a sickening thud. One of the royals, watching from a high tower, had fired a bolt from a crossbow, careless and arrogant in their seat of power. The bolt whistled through the air and struck the larger twin in the neck. His body froze, shock flashing in his eyes as blood poured from the wound. He collapsed to the ground, choking on his own blood, his hammer slipping from his hands. The remaining twins stared, confusion and rage boiling inside him. For a moment the world stood still. "They did this," Isolde hissed, her voice low and venomous. "They don't care about you. You're just a tool to them, a dog." The twin's fists clenched, his breathing heavy and ragged. The fury in his eyes burned brighter than the fires of battle. He roared, a sound that shook the walls of the fortress, and turned, not on Wilhelm or Caspar, but on the royals themselves. The twins' rage was unbound, a force of nature as he tore through the fortress with mindless fury. He smashed through walls, his hammer swinging wildly, destroying everything in his path. The slaves, seeing the chaos, rose in rebellion, their fear of the twin momentarily forgotten as they surged toward the royals. Wilhelm, battered and bloody, stood back as the fortress crumbled around him. The pipes that had once funneled clean water from the mountains cracked under the brute's assault, spilling precious water onto the stone floor. The royals, once untouchable in their high towers, scrambled for safety, but there was none to be found. The twin roared again, swinging his hammer with a force that shook the earth, bringing down one of the main towers. He had become a beast, a force of vengeance that could not be stopped. But when the final royal fell, crushed beneath the rubble of his own greed, the twin stood still, chest heaving, blood dripping from his wounds. The fortress was silent now, save for the steady drip of water from the shattered tanks. The twin stood among the wreckage, his breath heavy, his eyes distant. He looked down at his brother's broken body, and something flickered in his gaze, something almost human. "You're free now," Wilhelm said, his voice rough. The twin looked at him, then at the fortress he had torn apart. He said nothing, but his hammer fell from his hands, clattering to the stone floor. With the twins' help, Wilhelm's company gathered what water they could. Beryl drank, his breath slowing, though the creeping death still lingered in his veins. The water gave him strength, but not salvation. As they prepared to leave, the twin followed, a silent shadow at their side. He had nothing left in this world but the rage that still simmered beneath his skin. And in a world like this, rage could be a powerful ally.